Say hello to Katie.
Hi, Katie.
Katie, we hope you're doing well. I just am about to pick up with, again, we looked at why there are barriers to third-party candidates and third parties. They're also called minor parties sometimes too, so just keep in mind, don't have an absolute brain freeze if sometimes they change the word. Just look at it logically and try to relate it back to what you know, right? So third parties or minor parties are often kind of shut out for a number of factors, but they have played significant roles, and that's what we're going to look at right now is kind of some notable third parties, and then what we'll try to do is glean from them you know, a number of things from these stories, like, you know, what was the key to success? Why did they ultimately not do well? And ultimately, we'll begin to consider, should they play more of a role? You know, what value did they have in these cases, and should they play more of a role, all right? So we kind of talked about the most successful, at least from a numeric standpoint, right? The Bull Moose Party. Teddy Roosevelt is a two-term president, once elected. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right, because he came to office after the assassination of McKinley,
They
right?
tried to promote him out of a job into a do-nothing job, right?
So essentially, he is creating headaches. He's a progressive, and he's creating headaches in New York. And essentially, the idea was to mothball him as a vice president, to kind of take this hard charger who is creating all kinds of reform headaches and put him in the irrelevant office of the vice presidency. Lo and behold, there's an assassination, and along comes Teddy Roosevelt, right? So just look at the numbers. Again, we talked about the origins of the word, that there was not only McKinley is assassinated, but there's an attempted assassination. There's an assassination attempt on Roosevelt, which he survives, and true to his character, kind of, you know, has a little bit of bravado about it, that it takes more than this to bring down a bull moose, or I'm as fit as a bull moose, right? He gets 27% of the popular vote. He gets 88 electoral votes. He picks up a number of states, right? So he's in green here, kind of the lime green, and he picks up a number of states. So this is, you know, an instance where, I don't know, maybe you do see some viability in third-party candidates. Is it because he's, you know, held the office and he has this charisma? Is it kind of unique to him? Is it unique to the progressive period and some of his, you know, reform issues? Is this kind of a once-in-a-blue moon event, right? And I guess we'll figure that out a little bit as we go. The next third-party, notable kind of third-party event is the emergence of this American Independent Party led by George Wallace.
Actually, just back on that electoral map real quick. Even like although he didn't win any electoral votes, there's I asked this last year, I'm sure, but like with a minor vote there, like the white
Right.
sliver of the pie chart, would that be Eugene Debs, or was he dead by now?
I need to look at it because
He comes back every year.
here's the problem with the progressive movement. It's everybody, right? It's every issue and everybody, and there were a number. This kind of simplifies and boils down the electoral process. Exactly. So there would have to drill down on it a little bit. And again, my larger purpose is just to show you that there are points in times where a third party or minor party looks
Major.
yeah, looks like it has some chance. It looks like it has some viability. But even here, they kind of fall well short, as popular as Teddy Roosevelt is and as qualified as he is. In this instance, what we see, I guess, is the power of, I don't know, there's a way to phrase it delicately. There's racial divide. And you couple that with economic kind of uncertainty and fear, because the two often go hand in hand, and that obviously kind of gave Wallace more of a boost than, you know, we'd kind of like. This is, you know, this party is today, you know, hopefully looked on with a degree of, I don't know, contempt or shame, because really what it is it's a party that's championing, and notice it's in quotes, states' rights, but really what that is a code for is states' rights are being used at this point to block efforts to desegregate, you know, and in particular to integrate schools. So Wallace is one that begins to kind of give voice to that Southern anxiety in particular. And again, there's a lot of racism in the North. But what we have is perhaps people kind of, it's de facto kind of sorting. We're not as diverse in terms of who we're exposed to, and so it's a little more closeted. I would suggest the kind of the racial tensions that are there. When it comes to busing and desegregating and kind of like, we don't have segregation, we don't have separate facilities, but we definitely live in different kind of communities. And during the 70s, when we begin to kind of do this forced busing to integrate schools, wow, there's bricks thrown, there's protests, there's kind of, all kinds of ugliness that surfaces.
Yeah, it would just be like, well, the fact, like, while there was racism up in the north, down south you had so many incidents of like out and out violence.
Yep.
That's more notable.
It is more notable in that sense. I think it's more overt, but again, I think it has to do with how closely people live together too.
Right.
So do include that as a factor. At any rate, Wallace is going to kind of ride a lot of that anxiety. He's going to rail against liberals and communists in the Eastern press and federal judges. They're kind of their target often, aren't they? The communists we kick them around a lot. But the press, it's kind of interesting to see the press kind of being, like, if you're not printing what I like, I'm going after you. And the judges, if you're not ruling in the way I want, who are you unelected officials to legislate what we should do? You're appointed, you're not elected, and you're in this small number. So, and then, like I said, I love the term pointy-headed intellectuals. So some of the phrasing, some of the kind of classic things that come from him, and I'll show you some clips here in a second. He gives this kind of, he's a governor, and he gives this inaugural address. And in it, he talks about segregation and how that's the way of the South. It's this segregation, you'll see it, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It's a kind of an iconic moment, right? There's also an iconic moment when they're going to have to integrate the schools, and they know it, but he wants to make a kind of a stand against it. So there's this symbolic stand in the schoolhouse door to block 2 black students coming in. And there's some interesting, if you research this, behind the scenes things where the Kennedys knew he was doing it. He knew that this was a kind of a game of brinksmanship. There's a game of cat and mouse that goes on behind this. At any rate, he rides the economic uncertainty coupled with prejudice, gets 14% of the vote, gets 46 electoral votes, wins 5 states. So Ross Perot's party will get 19% of the vote, but it won't get electoral votes, it won't capture states. So there's a lot of ways to kind of quantify success.
Yeah, because I remember last year in Franco's class, we watched this documentary about about the civil rights movement in general, and they actually had, because he was alive at least when they were making the movie.
Right.
And there's an assassination attempt on him.
So what's really interesting is there's an assassination attempt, and in part, I don't know how much of a role it plays, but I think it is this come to Jesus moment for him, where maybe he wrestles with his own mortality and he wrestles with some issues. Towards the end, he actually is he flips on the issue of segregation. You're going to see, we'll talk about I don't know if you remember the Scottsboro Boys case.
Yeah.
He actually pardons, I forget which of the 9 that are kind of involved in that case. So there is an interesting kind of arc to him.
Right.
I do want to play you guys that clip of the famous speech during his inauguration so that you have a more, real sense of it.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
So he's portraying the federal government as tyrannical.
Let us send this message back to Washington by our representatives who are here with us today, that from this day we are standing up, and the heel of tyranny does not fit the neck of an upright man. That we intend to take the offensive and carry our fight for freedom across this nation, wielding the balance of power we know we possess in the Southland. That we, not the insipid blood voters
again, it's really interesting rhetoric to kind of talk about, hey, the federal government, this is overreach. Who are you to come in and tell the states what to do? This is a states' rights issue, and you are being tyrannical. Unfortunately, what it does is it conflates states' rights with this kind of, prejudice and desire to kind of segregate. It takes advantage, I think, of the framers' intent of the states as acting as kind of a safeguard. And what's interesting is to see how you feel about states' rights when you think about it in terms of, like, say, environmental protections. If the federal government is not doing enough in terms of, climate change, do you see it as a states' rights issue? If there is look at the Department of Education and think about maybe some of its policies. Would you want more local and autonomous kind of control? So, kind of interesting. At any rate, here is that kind of iconic image of him standing in the classroom door. There's an NPR clip I want to play for you, as hyper-liberal as that scene. I often find that they do things from a really academic or scholarly basis, and they do often try to bring in balance, but people do criticize on some level. But it does a nice job of giving you some background on this event. It is audio, so I have a campaign ad for you next that will spice things up. This is audio.
Today marks the 40th anniversary of Alabama Governor George Wallace's stand in the schoolhouse door, one of the most famous moments in the civil rights era. In a showdown with the Kennedy administration, the segregationist governor tried to prevent black students from enrolling at the University of Alabama, but Wallace knew he would fail, and the event was as much for show as for substance. Still, it would have implications for national politics for years to come, NPR's Debbie Elliott reports.
1963 was a turbulent year in Alabama, marked by bitter feuds over desegregation. In May, civil rights marchers had been turned back with police dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham. The tone was set early that year by a wiry 43-year-old Wallace during his inaugural address.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
The rhetoric echoed promises from the campaign trail in which Wallace talked of physically putting himself between the schoolhouse door and any attempt to integrate Alabama's all-white public schools. So when a federal judge ordered 2 black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, to be admitted to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa that summer, Wallace had the perfect opportunity to fulfill his pledge.
This was made for television drama.
Cully Clark is Dean of the College of Communication at the university and author of The Schoolhouse Door, Segregation's Last Stand at the University of Alabama.
Right here, on June 11, 1963, was a moment that both Wallace and the Kennedys saw as huge opportunity to make their statements.
He is sitting on campus in front of Foster Auditorium.
It doesn't look like a famous building. It does have a neoclassical facade to it, but otherwise it's a gymnasium.
Today, students of all races come and go through the doors to attend health classes here, and the gym floor is open for pickup volleyball or basketball games. Back in 1963, tables were set up in the gym for students to register for class. Vivian Malone Jones, then a 20-year-old transfer from an all-black college, wanted to sign up for accounting classes.
Believe it or not, at that point in my life, I expected it to go pretty smoothly. I mean, I had good grades, and I'd taken the SAT, college board exam, and everything, so I felt pretty prepared to go there. And, of course, I don't think the system was ready for me at that time, but I was ready for that.
And she had the force of the federal government behind her. President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, personally negotiated what was to happen in Tuscaloosa that summer. They hoped to avoid the bloodshed that resulted from integration at Ole Miss and in Little Rock. It was clear Wallace would make at least a symbolic stand in the door. He had argued that if he didn't shoulder that responsibility, other, more violent elements in the state might intervene. Clark says even after a personal visit from Robert Kennedy, Wallace was cagey about his exact plans.
They knew he would step aside. The fundamental question was how.
Just in case, Clark says, National Guard troops had practiced how to physically lift the governor out of the doorway. On June 11th, with temperatures soaring, a large contingent of national media looked on as Governor Wallace took his position in front of Foster Auditorium. State troopers surrounded the building. Then, flanked by federal marshals, Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach approached. Arms crossed at his chest and sweat soaking his pant legs from the knees down, Katzenbach told Wallace he simply wanted the governor to abide by the federal court order.
And I've come here to ask you now for an unequivocal assurance that you will permit these students, who after all merely want an education at a great university. Well, you make your statement, but we don't need you to make a speech. You make your statement. I will make my statement, Governor. I was in the process of making my statement. I'm asking from you an unequivocal assurance that you will not bar entry to these students, to Vivian Malone and to James Hood, and that you will step aside peacefully.
Wallace refused and had his own speech prepared.
I stand here today as governor of this sovereign state and refuse to willingly submit to illegal usurpation of power by the central government. I claim today for all the people of the state of Alabama those rights reserved to them under the Constitution of the United States. Among those powers so reserved and claimed is the right of state authority in the operation of the public schools, colleges, and universities.
Katzenbach took the two black students, who had been waiting in a car nearby, to their dorms. Malone and Hood settled into their rooms and ate lunch. Meanwhile, Katzenbach called President Kennedy, who federalized the Alabama National Guard to help with the crisis. Clark says later that afternoon, Katzenbach returned with a contingent of National Guardsmen commanded by General Henry Graham.
General Graham then goes up to the governor and says, "It is my sad duty to ask you to step aside." The governor then, in effect, says, "I am now responding to overwhelming federal force, and I am stepping aside."
The governor left campus, and the students returned to Foster to register for classes. But 40 years later, that's not the image that lingers. Vivian Malone Jones.
Rather than the stand, which had its role there for the people who were trying to keep things like they were, but for those of us who were trying to open the doors and change things, I saw it as a change. And I see myself as being part of that change in the South and in Alabama and at the university, where doors could be opened for generations to come.
Yet the event was, in a way, a victory for the governor, says Cully Clark.
The symbolism here could be compared to Appomattox, where the South learned that it is not ignoble to surrender, that one can in fact surrender with honor, as long as one has made a stand.
Indeed, Wallace was catapulted into the national spotlight and went on to make 4 runs at the presidency. It was also a watershed event for President Kennedy, who, in standing down the South's most defiant segregationist, aligned himself solidly with the civil rights movement. The result, Clark says, was the beginning of the end of the solid Democratic South. Debbie Elliott, NPR News.
All right, so you can see maybe why I like it from an academic standpoint. That's a pretty comprehensive look at this event. And what it shows you is kind of the bottomless, like I could have just shown you the picture, right? But there's maybe 6-7 minutes of kind of context, and you realize, wow, there's a lot more to understand. And I think it's really interesting. It's striking how we can frame it as this is a symbol of barring. You know, can you imagine if you were told you couldn't go to a university because of your race, gender, religion, whatever it is? And this is a symbol of kind of like, denial of rights, but the door was open. You know, both used it for their own optics. So I do think it's kind of interesting in that sense.
Genuine question. So, like, when those 2 black students did finally attend the University of Alabama, how were they treated when they finally got there?
So there's the next kind of layer or whatever. I loved her line of the, I don't know if they were ready for me, but I was ready for them.
Yeah.
Again, I don't have, but I am sure there were tensions. I am sure there were all kinds of, ugly, maybe moments and events. I'm hopeful that there were also, signs of humanity where people were decent.
Right. I mean,
But
she's
I don't
had it.
have that info, to be honest with you. That's kind of the, you know, when you and I were talking earlier about teaching, it's this bottomless well
Yeah.
of constantly, like, you know, realizing how, the more I know, how little I know.
Right.
Because that's the next question. I do want to play for you guys kind of a campaign ad that, you know, rolls a lot of this up into one. In other words, you've seen how he used these events to kind of catapult himself. How did he kind of run his national campaign? How did he cloak some of what he's talking about?
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Follow as your children are bused across town.
As president, I shall, within the law, turn back the absolute control of the public school systems to the people of the respective states.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Open a little business and see what might happen.
As president, I will stand up for your local police and firemen in protecting your safety and property.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Watch your hard-earned tax dollars sail away to anti-American countries.
As president, I will halt the giveaway of your American dollars and products to those nations that aid our enemies.
Wallace has the courage to stand up for America. Give him your support.
How do you win an election?
Story.
You tell the story and you sell what?
Fear.
Hope for fear, right? Are
Well, he
those
didn't
some,
even have a campaign slogan, did he?
are those some classic fears?
Yeah.
You know, change, societal change, crime, economic kind of fears. Again, it gave him, you know, quite an electoral success story, I suppose, albeit, you know, limited to the southern states.
First second I thought he did win Alabama. I was gonna say, oh, the iron thing.
Yeah.
Was that?
No,
Then
first
he-
second I
he-
thought.
Well, you didn't think he won his own state?
First second, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
So
kind of shocked he won Louisiana.
here's, yeah, I mean, there's a geography there. So here's one of the more, I think, captivating stories. Again, you're going to see 19% of the vote here, but you're not going to see any kind of electoral success, or we're not going to flip any states. But man, is Ross Perot kind of engaging. He's a Texan, so there's a great drawl. He is a walking kind of caricature in terms of, he's got this nasal drawl, and he's got just a quirky, folksy way to him, and man, was it appealing on some levels. He's a billionaire. We seem to like these kind of self-made, success stories here. He ran a company that started essentially a data processing, had a data processing component that is bought out by General Motors, and he gets ridiculously wealthy, and decides that his wealth and his opportunity are a platform to kind of push for reform that neither of the parties are addressing. So he is, on some level, really enigmatic in that it's hard to put a label on him. He is against heavy-handed intrusion, but that, there's this religious right movement at this point that's saying prayer in schools and trying to find expanded ways to kind of have religious influence in your daily life, and he pushes back against that the same way he does governmental intrusion. That doesn't kind of fit, either of the parties at this point, right? That you might see the Republican Party being more, supportive or solicitous of that religious right. They have their fiscal kind of side, but they also have their social conservatism. And he kind of comes down somewhere in the middle. Same thing with his idea of he really sees the number one issue that people are fearful of at this point is a rising deficit as opposed to debt, right? What's debt versus deficit?
Debt is per year, deficit is total.
Okay, so every year we have a debt, and that debt accumulates, that's the deficit, and the deficit clock, remember when I showed you pictures of those, is like frozen, we're out of numbers. So we're worried about this, and he says what we need is tax increases. Well, who's against tax increases?
Republicans.
The Republicans, right? In general, it's tax increases for who? Right? So if it's an across-the-board tax increase, we're not necessarily for it as Republicans, but he's also calling for program cuts. Who would be opposed to that? Democrats, right? So this makes him really unique. And then, man, is his campaigning style really unique. he goes on the talk show circuits, like Larry King Live. I don't know if you know him. You'll see a little clip of him in here in a second. He was the kind of the precursor to a lot of the late night talk shows. He started with a radio show, and then it became kind of like a TV broadcast of the radio show. Strange.
Like you're talking about like David Letterman kind of talk show, or more like
News,
Rachel Maddow kind of show?
more like a Rachel Maddow kind of thing, but it's kind of newsy, but he also had entertainers on.
Right.
His goal is not to be funny necessarily, it's to be entertaining.
Right.
But he's trying to give you the newsmakers.
Right.
He's also going to take advantage of kind of like cable news in the wide open kind of format that it has. They often were looking to kind of fill time, and so there's infomercials. Have you guys seen them? It's harder to find now. You got to kind of turn into the right channel at the right hour where they're not running any regular kind of broadcast stuff, and somebody is like pitching duct tape for like 30 minutes, right?
When a Kenma knife cut through a shoe?
Yeah, so it's like those Ginsu knife commercials and things like that, but he's running it as a political ad, literally 30-minute, hour-long infomercials where he's going to be sitting down with his own charts and graphs. And again, the folksy way is really kind of captivating. So, give you a clip.
Let's go down to grassroots America where the people are hurting. And everybody's saying, why are we in this mess? First thing I'd like you to do, all of you, is look in the mirror. We're the owners of this country. We don't act like the owners. We act like white rabbits that get programmed by messages coming out of Washington. We own this place.
Is there any scenario in which you would run for president? Can you give me a scenario in which you'd say, okay, I'm in?
Number one, I don't want to.
I know. Is there
Number
a scenario?
two, you know, if you're that serious, you, the people, are that serious, you register me in 50 states. And if you're not willing to organize and do that, then this is all just talk. Stay with me, Larry.
Are you
I'm
saying-
saying to the ordinary folks, if you're dead serious,
Start
then
committees.
I want to see some sweat. I want to see some sweat. Why do I want to see some sweat? I said it earlier. I want you in the ring.
All right, so you can already see, is there kind of an appeal to him? He's quirky, he's folksy, doesn't want the position. Man, we love people that are running out of obligation as opposed to craving kind of power for ego. Here's kind of segments of his infomercials.
Ignoring the pundits and bypassing the scrutiny of the traditional press to get his message out, Perot
Bypassing the
created the
press.
first political infomercials to be broadcast on network television.
A great young lady from Louisiana sent me this voodoo stick, and I will use it as my pointer tonight. And certainly it's appropriate because, as you and I know, we are indeed voodoo. Well, let's get right to work. Let's sort of do a quick summary of what we discussed before in terms of where we are, then we'll go to the solution. We're $4.1 trillion in debt. It's a staggering burden to pay to our children. It's untimely.
Look at the stat.
Just this year, we ran up $341 billion in new debt, as we discussed the other night. That's our legislators and our president trying to buy our vote this year with what used to be our money. We're not that dumb.
So this is amazing because this is low tech, isn't it? I mean, we don't have PowerPoint. We've literally had to print up charts and graphs on a big stack of note cards, essentially. And he's got a voodoo stick because he's called George Herbert Walker Bush's economic policies voodoo economics, right? So now he's got this voodoo stick because we're indeed voodoo. And he will go on for an hour pointing at charts and graphs. It's captivating. Again, people thought either you really loved him or you thought, oh, this guy is off the rails. And we're going to see that in a second, right? So what you find, read this. I mean, it's true. That polls in May and June showed him ahead of Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush. The problem is he's a little mercurial. He actually drops out at one point. He was in the race and now he's out. And then he's back in, and his support had somewhat cratered, but he had enough support that he actually got in the debates. Usually, you saw with the Republicans, they had like 14 different candidates and they were debating. And then did they bring in Jill Stein? Do they bring in these others? Well, when you get to the general election debates, you have to have a significant percentage of the vote to be in debates, and he had it. He still had a 15% approval rating. He got into the debates. So in a second, I'm going to show you on stage Bush, Perot, and Clinton. It's pretty wild.
I remember, and I mean, I'm glad you brought him up because I remember my dad was talking about him to me like probably like 5 years ago, and I remember he was telling me that he was probably the most successful third party guy. But also he told me that like when he dropped out, this was my dad's been on it, he told me that there might have been some sort of like threat involved in the dropping out or something.
There always is oppositional research that goes on that maybe we're going to use this against you, we're going to use that against you. It completely possible, and it just is like you saw too. You question sometimes whether he had the stomach for it. He doesn't necessarily want to run, but he's doing it out of obligation supposedly.
So if he hadn't dropped out, was there a good chance he would have been like runner-up?
I don't know if at one point, like I said, he's ahead in the polls.
Yeah.
And Clinton is kind of famous for being the comeback kid. He kind of really stumbled out of the gates, but then picked up momentum. And again, momentum's a real key. Herbert Walker Bush has the recession, the deficit kind of hanging over him. Is seen as not as capable as Reagan, kind of in his shadow. So I don't know what to predict necessarily, but this isn't his only misstep. I'm going to show you, if I have time, who he selected for his vice presidential nominee. And people kind of looked at that as his choice and went, ooh. And you'll see why in a second if I get to it. All right? So,
Like Sarah Palin with that?
more so just seemed a little fuzzy. His name is General Stockdale, and he was Vietnam hero of sorts.
Right.
But you wondered if he was battling senility or dementia, and you'll see why in a second. It gets spooked. Okay, so here comes the debates.
The dollar's gone through the floor. Now, whose fault is that? Not the Democrats, not the Republicans. Somewhere out there's an extraterrestrial that's doing this to us, I guess. And everybody says they take responsibility. Somebody somewhere has to take responsibility for this. Now, just for the record, I don't have any spin doctors. I don't have any speech writers. Probably shows. I make those charts you see on television even. Now.
All right, he's charming in a lot of ways, but again, there's, like I said, there's a little concern about, is he too mercurial? Is he too quirky? Is he, and again, you're going to a third-party candidate, so there is this kind of leap of faith, right? What you see, again, when you were saying your dad's talking about him being one of the most effective, well, he certainly got into the debates. He certainly helped frame up the conversation about being about the deficit. And he gets the parties to kind of have to co-opt some of his issues. If they want him to go away, you better start talking about the deficit and the fiscal conservatism that typifies the Republican conservative kind of side, and maybe not so much of these social issues. That seems to be what the public was saying. But like I said, there's some missteps that make people really worry about it, and chief among them is his selection for a vice presidential nominee. This is Admiral Stockdale, and there's just kind of a quick clip on him where he is in the debates, and he's going to ask a rhetorical question, but you start to wonder, is it a serious question? It's a rhetorical question, but you're going to wonder if it's a serious question. You ready?
Who am I? Why am I here?
He's from nowhere.
I'm not a politician, everybody knows that. So don't expect me to use the language of the Washington Insider. 37 years in the Navy, and only one of them up there in Washington. And now I'm an academic. The centerpiece of my life was the Vietnam War. I was there the day it started. I led the first bombing raid against North Vietnam. I was there the day it ended, and I was there for everything in between. 10 years in Vietnam, aerial combat, and torture. I know things about the Vietnam War better than anybody in the world. I know some things about the Vietnam War better than anybody in the world. And I know how governments, how American governments can be.
All right, so he was drowning in air.
So he's trying to do it off script. I can't believe that just cut out right there.
When a teacher calls on you and you don't have your work prepared.
Also, is it because of the camera that he looks kind of blue? Or is it
Who
just...
am I? Why am I in Vietnam? Years in Vietnam, aerial combat, and
don't leave, just watch the rest of it.
I I know things about the Vietnam War better than anybody in the world. I know some things about the Vietnam War better than anybody in the world. And I know how governments, how American governments can be courageous and how they can be coward. And that's important. That's one thing I'm an insider on.
Okay, I'm gonna just hold you here for half a second. Is it a major gaffe? He starts out, it's rhetorical and it's folksy. Who am I? Why am I here? Because I've been picked I'm a completely atypical candidate. Right. It is a rhetorical question. But when he gets a little lost because he's not this polished individual who can remember his speech entirely and eventually has to put on the glasses and pick up the thread, because he wandered, they began to think there is, something wrong with him. That gaffe really was one of the most significant blows to hold on one second, I'll play this for you tomorrow, but it was a huge gaffe and it gets picked up on. It's not going to. Saturday Night Live had a field day with this. And I'm going to show you this tomorrow. Just kind of keep in mind, that's the rule of politics. If you're Howard Dean and you go, yeah, you're dead. If your vice president kind of stumbles, you're dead. Does that still apply today?
No, apparently not.
All right, so that's the last idea I wanted to leave you with. Say goodbye to Katie.
Bye, Katie.